Good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson School. I'm Cecilia Rouse, the Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School. I'm very pleased to be here today to welcome you to today's talk, The Tyranny of Scale. Our speaker is Rajiv Vinnakota, a co-founder and managing director of the national nonprofit Seed Foundation. The mission of the Seed Foundation is to bring outstanding educational opportunities to underserved inner-city youth and communities. It partners with urban communities to provide innovative educational opportunities to prepare underserved students for success in college and beyond. It's really very quite impressive. Their innovative model combines rigorous academic program with a nurturing boarding program, and it's really that boarding program that makes it quite unique. And the Seed School of the Washington, D.C., the Foundation's first project, is the nation's only public access college prep boarding school for inner city youth. Raj has many ties to Princeton. They're really quite deep. He's a member of the, what is it, the wonderful class? The great class. I'm still learning, and I'm not wearing any orange either. Of the great class of 1993. He's a former university trustee, and in 2009 was named the winner of the Princeton's Woodrow Wilson Award, the highest honor given to an undergraduate alumnus. Raj has been awarded many other fellowships, as you might imagine. He was awarded one by the Echoing Green Foundation and Ashoka, was named a Washingtonian of the Year by Washingtonian Magazine, and received the Manhattan Institute Social Enterprise Award, and most importantly, was an Oprah Winfrey Use Your Life awardee. So I think you will agree that Raj is a fantastic example of our unofficial motto, in the nation's service and in the service of all nations. So we're pleased to have you here today, Raj. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cece, and congratulations on your appointment as Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School. We'll practice that great class in 1993. We'll get you there. I know we will. So, it's so wonderful to see friends here I've seen, and thank you very much for coming. I think it's important just for all the Woodrow Wilsoners to know just how much being a certificate student here was one of the great blessings of being at Princeton University. I was able to interact with some of the most knowledgeable, most committed, best educators on the planet, and I'm grateful for that experience. I've taken many of those lessons in the professional work that I do today, and both the Woodrow Wilson School and Princeton gave me the tools through the liberal arts curriculum, the deep social networks, the challenging quantitative and analytical requirements to be able to engage in my work so successfully. People often ask me, Raj, what are the most important characteristics that allowed you and Eric, the other co-founder, to be successful at starting Seed? And I always point to two of them. By far the two most important were that we were naive and we were stubborn. And while my naivete can probably be attributed to a personal fault, I'd like to thank the Woodrow Wilson School for making me so stubborn. It really kind of forced me to challenge thinking, conventional at time, not so conventional, to use analytics in terms to come to my own conclusions. And we had to do that over and over and over again in starting Seed. But I'm actually not here today to discuss what the Woodrow Wilson School did do to help me, but rather to discuss what it did not do to prepare me. And I won't even tell you what those ramifications have been on my sleep and on my sanity. But I do want to talk about that. And in order to do that, I need to first tell you a little bit about my journey, a seed that was planted in Milwaukee where I grew up, sprouted as an idea in Tower Club's tap room in 1994, took root in one of Washington, D.C. most impoverished neighborhoods, and now has matured to the point where I can come back and talk to you about it. Growing up in Milwaukee, I was a science geek. I know this makes Shirley very happy. I loved science. I loved biology. I loved research. And I came to Princeton with the idea that I wanted to find the cure for AIDS. Because of my parents' support throughout high school, I was able to do some research that allowed me to be the type of applicant that I could actually get in here. And though John Templeton, who now works here at the Woodrow Wilson School, was in the admissions department over at West College. He swears he never saw my application that year. But if you don't like the fact that I'm here, you can blame him. And when I came here, I studied molecular biology and also received a certificate here at the Woodrow Wilson School. And I was one of those crazy people who wrote 2 senior theses and got completely burned out. So I decided to take some time off before going on to do that MD, PhD, and ended up in all places management consulting, which was cool because all my friends were doing it. And it was really neat for my parents because it would allow me to pay off my debts in a couple of years. And I loved it. I loved working in management consulting because I learned so much and it gave me a set of tools that I don't think I could have gotten anywhere else at the age of 22. But I also knew fairly early on that it's not what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. So I started the journey to try to figure out what would be my social footprint. And at my first college reunion, on that Saturday, 4 of my friends and I were sitting around the Princeton Tower Club tap room talking about how we wanted to change the world. And quickly gravitated to a discussion around urban education. And one of my friends asked me, there are boarding schools for wealthy children. Why not boarding schools for those who need them the most? And it was that simple thought that I took with me in my head for the next couple of years. And in 1996, decided to take a leave of absence and traveled around the country with another simple thought. You can't tell me 5 of us drinking a beer were the first ones to come up with this idea. And so I was able to get in front of policymakers, educators, spent time at different boarding schools, started to do the financial analysis to try to understand, can this be done? And as a result of those 2 months, I was able to start to put together a business plan. And then in early 1997, brought together a group of 12 people so that we could actually put together the milestones for how we get from here, this idea, to actually opening a school. And at the end of a weekend of hard work, this other young man, Eric Adler, who I only met one time before that day, and I decided that we would go into business together. And the next day, we both went and gave notice at our respective management consulting firms. On March 1st of 1997, left our jobs and started to try to open the nation's first urban public boarding school. I am fond of saying that we started off at a dead sprint, not realizing we were running a marathon. And we were able to successfully open that school 15 months later, a school where students live from Sunday night through Friday afternoon on our campus. Grades 6 through 12, where the students come in the 6th grade and stay with us all the way through until graduating from high school. Chosen through a lottery, so that we're not picking the best and the brightest, but actively targeting those kids, especially east of the river, in wards 7 and 8 in Washington, D.C., who could really benefit from being in a 24-hour environment. And also at the same time being in close proximity to the students that we serve. In Washington, D.C., roughly 75% of our students come from a 6-mile radius. And that's the point. We want them to be able to understand that they can be an asset and that the institution can still be an asset in the community itself. Seed is public. Families don't have to pay in order for their students to attend. And by having a lottery, we provide equal access to the school. And we're also unabashedly college preparatory. We believe that any child, if given the necessary support, access to role models, constant pressure in the positive sense that they can make it, that they will be able to succeed, and that they will be able to go to college. Now, one may think, why do we need seed schools? Might be obvious, because there are kids who could really benefit from being in this sort of environment. But on a public policy level, the reason for seed school is much broader. Not only are there a group of children who can't be successful in the traditional day school, but by getting those students to come to seed, you're probably helping that day school so that those students aren't a bad influence on the kids to the left and the right and front and behind them. And so we're able to have the secondary effect of helping the whole system. And keep in mind that when we started this, seed was just a hypothesis, right? I say hypothesis because I'm a scientist. You can say an innovation, a test of this concept. The idea being that if a child is given an opportunity, that they will be successful. And these children, we felt, had the ability to be successful, even though 85% of them come from single or no-parent homes. 90% of them would be the first in their family to attend college. On average, they come in about 2 to 3 grade levels behind. So they're 6th graders in name, but 3rd and 4th graders in terms of their reading and writing ability. And roughly a third of them have at least one incarcerated family member. So how did we do it? How did we actually start the school? Well, there's many things that need to be done in order to start a school, but in the end, there's really 5 aspects that you need to be able to succeed at. The first, you need to be able to convince the community that this is a school that they want. It's a little easier now. There's 2 schools operating and 2 about to operate. But you can imagine that a skinny Indian kid and a short Jewish guy walking through inner city DC is probably not going to build a lot of support initially. Especially when our first refrain is, we'd like to take your child and have him live with us. But a lot of that community support and a lot of building that credibility is about walking the walk. Is about acknowledging what you know and what you don't know and wanting to constantly improve. And at times, also basically passing the test. And that test does at times sound like, how dare you tell me that you can raise my child better than you can. And part of the message is, no, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to raise your child with you. We're trying to work together so that we can be successful. And that's why we located the school just down the block, just down the street, and we need your help to be successful. Because every parent wants the best for their child, whether or not they have the ability to actually be able to help. Then, second, we had the most difficult challenge of all, which is, how do we pay for this, right? A boarding school costs about 3 times as much to operate as a regular school. So in Washington, D.C., it costs us about $35,000 per student per year. And in D.C., it's about $12,000 per student per year for a regular day school. Well, we ended up having to amend the law that defined how schools are funded in the District of Columbia by finding an exception and saying that boarding students could receive more money. May sound simple, but we had to go to Congress to get that amendment passed. And then we had to come back to the D.C. City Council and work with them to insert the statutory language so that now we receive 2.7 times as much as a regular day school receives in the District of Columbia, which allows us to run, at our 340 student capacity, a school that is financially sustainable. The Seed School of D.C., with 340 students, gets 97% of its revenue from public funds. We know that the school is sustainable and will continue to exist into perpetuity. And that is by far the single largest hill we have to climb every time we start a school. But it's not the only one. The third is finding a site. And one may think, oh, that's easy to do. There's all kinds of schools that are closing. But the school and the site needs to be large enough to have dormitories, to have space for children to run around in, because they're with us 24 hours a day, not just 8 hours a day. The other thing that a site does for us is it provides tangibility, right? Visions and heads are great, but being able to point to a place and say, that's going to be our home, is even better. And it's even better for the fourth reason, the fundraising. The private dollars that you need to raise to build that campus, the private debt that you need to take on to build that campus, and to convince donors that this is a real entity that deserves their support. And then fifth, by far the most important piece to ensure that you have not a good school, but a great school, is human capital. Any nonprofit, and certainly in the education world, is completely dependent and a function of the people that you hire to run, to operate, to teach. And making sure that you're able to bring together an institution that does that requires getting people who are risk takers to jump in with you and to work with you and to say, we can educate any child. So how have we done? Well, in DC, over 90% of our students who enter the 9th grade graduate from high school. Over 90% are accepted and attend four-year colleges. 2 years ago, Harvard economist Roland Fryer did an analysis that followed both the students who got selected through the lottery and those that didn't, and was able to show that seed schools have the power to eliminate the racial achievement gap in 4 years. So that by the time our student is a freshman in high school, we have broken that gap. They are able to be working with us at the same level as any child. Most excitingly, we've seen our students graduate from school, get accepted to college, go off to college, and graduate from schools such as Brown, Penn, Morehouse, Virginia Tech, state schools, historically black colleges and universities, and of course my favorite, Princeton University class of 2009. I'm sorry, the great class of 2009. And now SEED is growing. We have a school in Baltimore that we opened in 2008, and we'll be opening a SEED school of Cincinnati and a SEED school of Miami in the next 2 years. So SEED has had many successes, and you may be wondering, what didn't Raj get from the Woodrow Wilson School that's keeping him up at night? And the answer is how to tackle the biggest challenge that I have, the challenge of growth. From the beginning, one of the major questions that SEED faced, and I'd be willing to bet that most other education reformers, social entrepreneurs, and growing nonprofits have faced, is how to respond to the refrain, too slow and not enough. Said differently, we're being asked, how do we scale? The things that we've done to date at SEED, difficult as they may have been, and important as they have been, are just a precursor to this question and this great challenge. How does SEED address the challenge of too slow and not enough? So what I'd like to do and spend my time on for the rest of this talk is to talk about too slow and not enough, and why I think that this phrase actually illustrates a focus on the wrong thing, not at SEED solely, but in the field of social innovation. So what does it mean to actually scale social innovation? There's many, many definitions, and I'll give you two. Kevin Starr, who's the managing director at the Malago Foundation, and the Malago Foundation's tagline is, "Lasting change that goes to scale," was quoted in a blog in the Stanford Center for Social Innovation, and he said that scalable solutions meet 4 criteria. They're cost-effective, sustainable, replicable, and have real impact. In New York, the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation has the following view on scale. Achieving scale means different things for different organizations. For some, it may be expanding within one city. For others, it may be expanding to new counties or states. In every instance, it means serving greater numbers of young people while maintaining or improving the quality of service. So what there's little question of, at least as I see it, is the idea that scale is becoming the overriding focus in social innovation today. Much more important than any other factor in making strategic, funding, and branding decisions. Jeff Braddock, the managing director, co-founder of the Bridgespan Group, a management consulting firm that spun off of Bain that's focused on helping nonprofits, wrote, "Today there may be no idea with greater currency in the social sector than scaling what works." The explosion of venture philanthropy funds, New Profit Inc., Venture Philanthropy Partners, Silicon Valley Social Venture Fund, New Schools Venture Fund, and many others have taken an increasing share of private philanthropy funds and focused on children and education improvement. These funds have focused on the idea that taking high-impact projects and growing them to scale and how to do it. And at least in the youth development and education sector, the entry of major hedge fund and venture capital donors has intensified this focus as they bring their business perspective to their philanthropy. And this focus has also influenced public policy. If we look at 2 of the major new federal sources of funding for education reform, we see that they also have been impacted by the venture and scale perspective. One is a White House Social Innovation Fund, which is entirely based on scale. Another is the Department of Education's I3 grants, where scale is given one of the largest point factors in evaluating its possibility. If you do a quick internet search, You'll see numbers of papers, articles, examples, and discussions from sources such as Pathways, the Innovation Journal, INSEAD, the Stanford Social Innovation Review around scale. And topics there include scaling methods, challenges, case studies. One would think from all of these conversations, the focus, the discussion, the new research regarding how and why to scale, that's easy to assume scale is it. But I think that such a view is too simplistic. Don't get me wrong, scaling is really important. Eric and I didn't get into the field so that we could help 10, 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 children. I know that we're looking to make societal impact because we want to make more than just a small dent to the problem. And also, SEED has received a fair amount of support for us to consider and determine how we scale. In 2006, we received $3 million from venture philanthropy partners, and then last year we received $3.5 million from the White House Social Innovation Fund and the McConnell Clark Foundation so that we could look into scaling. So I understand the need to look at this. I understand the need to think about it. My concern is that this hyper-focus on scale and growth to the marginalization of other important motivations and assessments of intervention actually lead to bad policy and bad programs. Why? I'll give you 3 arguments. The first is that an overemphasis on scalability leads to interventions that are more focused on numbers of people that are being helped rather than on the quality of the intervention. Entrepreneurs and organizations end up focusing on simpler approaches that actually help more people because simpler approaches can be expanded more rapidly. It neglects the difficult interventions because they're more complicated, they're more costly, and they won't grow as quickly. Just as troublesome, these same interventions, which are appropriate for low-need clients in whatever intervention that you have, end up being applied to higher-need clients and don't succeed, rendering those interventions ineffective. As these solutions begin to develop around the lowest common denominator for approaches, people start to look at the least that you can do to try to be successful, rather than trying to be successful as the end. This has a tendency to push towards short-term measures and improvements, rather than breaking established cycles of poverty and human suffering. I'm reminded of a story to illustrate the implication of focusing too hard on numbers. Eric and I were in a meeting in 2007 with the governor of a certain state. We told him all about SEED and the school that we wanted to build for 300 to 400 students. And the governor said, if he was going to spend an additional $7 to $8 million on a new educational initiative, he wanted to affect $300,000 students, not just 300. So Eric said, with all due respect, Governor, that's like $25 a kid. I don't think that you're really going to change their lives, do you? What are you going to do? Buy them a snack? For the rest of the meeting, the governor kept saying, and I'm not just talking about buying them a bag of Fritos. But Eric was right. The solutions that come, the solutions to some of our society's toughest problems are not one size fits all and are not superficial in nature. And they can't be reduced to a level of redistributing a small token. This won't affect real change. The solutions are complex, they're multifaceted, and they'll need to work together with a whole set of interventions in order to be successful on a societal basis. Just as one example, we don't posit at SEED that we are the solution. Rather, that we need to be part of the solution spectrum, an intervention for a specific number of children who really need to be in a 24-hour environment, and that we can help them reduce the cycle of poverty. More troublesome to me is I also find that when solutions, even when solutions make sense on an ROI and a return on investment basis, the push for scale may distort about how to think about these investment priorities. Sometimes serving the few who are the greatest burden should be scaled even if the number of people served is much smaller than other approaches. People often look at what we do at SEED and say, it's so expensive. And schools like KIPP and Aspire and YES, They're doing a great job and they cost less. Why don't you just do what they do? Eric, once again, has a pithy and perfect response. You'll probably all want to meet Eric. You're like, who's Raj? I want to meet Eric. He says, roads are much simpler and cheaper to build than bridges. So why don't we focus on just building roads? Because there are kids who live on islands. If we don't build in the bridge, they will never have the pathway to success. As a society, we like to calculate the cost per child and only build the pathways that are cheapest. So everybody is building roads and leaving the kids on the islands for dead. Seed builds bridges because nobody does, and somebody must. Like I said, you got to meet Eric. Now, the good news is that people do start to understand this. For instance, U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan and the White House pushed for funding of the bottom 5% of schools through a program called SIG, the School Improvement Grant Program. And this program provided grants just focused on those most needy schools. So we're starting to see this kind of commitment. But I would argue that on a societal basis, we still have that over-focus on scale, which leads to an over-focus on numbers, rather than comprehensive approaches. My second argument is that an overemphasis on scalability decreases innovation and experimentation. An overemphasis on scalability decreases innovation and experimentations. And in the long term, that means we have fewer effective models. Let's look at one that hopefully most of us know, Harlem Children's Zone. As you may know, Harlem Children's Zone is an organization in Harlem, New York, not a surprise, that provides comprehensive support for children and families, including parenting workshops, preschool programs, 3 public charter schools, child-oriented health programs, and on and on and on. The project was founded by Jeffrey Canada. It's now expanded to nearly 100 blocks in central Harlem. And the idea of Harlem Children's Zone was not approached with a scalability perspective, even though now people think of it that way. Society looked at Harlem Children's Zone, looked at what Jeffrey Canada was doing, looked at the hundreds of millions of dollars that he needed to raise and said, hey, something's working here. We need to try to do it again. And Harlem Children's Zone has also become a test lab. Programs like Baby College that works with parents from the moment that they're in prenatal work all the way through getting them into grade school. Other smaller parts of Harlem Children's Zone, from the charter schools to the transition and support programs for college, may be scalable and are being tested. And Roland Fryer, the Harvard economist, is looking at constituent parts and trying to figure out their value. If we'd used the scalability test to decide whether or not Harlem Children's Zone was started, it would have failed. Yet the impact of its program now, the innovative subcomponents, and the mind shift that it's created really has successfully pushed forward how we think about interventions. And I would say that in addition to Harlem Children's Zone, there's other community-based models that are highly experimental, locally focused, and not easily scalable, that are really, truly innovative. When Eric and I started SEED in 1997, we were so focused on getting the CDC school started that we didn't focus on scalability. We focused on innovation. And as we became more established, we then started to think about scalability. And I'd like to argue that that's the mindset that we need to take in many of our approaches. Lee Shore, a social scientist, senior fellow at the Study for Social Policy, also a SEED Foundation board member, said that what we know today isn't the destination, but just a starting point. She says, we can't stop at scaling up what we know works today. We have to innovate to achieve a far greater impact tomorrow. So this over-focus on scale on the front end ends up impeding innovative approaches and experimentation that should and does take place when you try many different things. And now my third and final argument. We're placing such a significant emphasis around scale, yet we still don't know how to scale effectively. There's a hypothesis that we can take the growth models in business, apply them to social issues, but frankly, we're not really sure about that yet. In 2007, people at the Young Foundation wrote for the Skoll Center of entrepreneurship that, quote, surprisingly little is known about social innovation compared to the vast amount of research into innovation in business and science. It misses the fact that there's an entire body of research regarding innovation in economic growth, but very little research in the metrics surrounding social innovation. Robert Granger, who's the president of the W.T. Grant Foundation, has looked into this, and he's found very little evidence that it's possible to successfully scale and maintain a program's effectiveness. He's also said that the current research focuses on the conditions under which programs succeed, and we need more focus on that, and we need to learn the how and the why of scaling now so that we can really get successful at it in the future. Having said that, there are organizations that have scaled effectively or are in the process of scaling effectively. I'd point out Youth Villages, Nurse Family Partnership, KIP, who have begun the successful push towards scale, but we still need to continue to research how and why. Here's something that we also don't know. We don't know whether locally based, community-driven organizations are better options for serving communities than a scaling enterprise that comes from the outside. Chris Deiglamer, who's the executive director of the Center for Social Innovation at Stanford, asks 3 questions about this issue that I ask you to keep in mind when you think about social innovation. Are local areas better served when a number of organizations come in from the outside or when the local organization grows itself? Does the introduction of new scalable models in a community bring new positive ways of working? And what model or combinations of models is best for the future in terms of sustained positive change for clients and community development? We don't know the answers to these yet. So what do we know? We know that scaling social innovation is not like franchising. It's not like franchising. It's much more situational and more impacted by local variables. And here's the important thing. It's completely dependent on the quality of the people. So this is exactly the opposite of the franchising model, which intends to standardize processes so that people are interchangeable. There's not yet enough evidence that scaling social innovation will actually lead to this kind of change. And my experience tells me that this is true, that people are the fundamental asset that allows us to be able to scale. And so therefore, figuring out how you have this direct function that identifies, hires, supports great individual is probably at the core of how we scale effectively. But I know that franchising, though it seems to address that too slow and not enough challenge, really doesn't. Let me tell you one story from the for-profit world about growth and funding. A few years ago, a friend and supporter of Seed, that I think many of us in the room actually know, told us the story of deciding which one of his 2 private companies to take public. He met with his investment bankers who analyzed both companies. Company A had a solid balance sheet, strong and stable revenue base, and was profitable. Company B was just getting to its feet, had a small but quickly growing and expanding revenue and customer base, and had not yet become profitable. What did the investment bankers say? Strongly, go public with Company B. Why? Because investment bankers can sell growth to the market much more easily than a stable business, even when that business is not yet profitable. The happy ending for our friend is that he did take Company B public first, did very well, and then a few years later took Company A public and did very well again. But you can see this growth mentality and how pervasive it is, that even in the American way, that there's such a focus around growth, and now it's moved into the nonprofit world and into society in general. So what's next? What should we try to do to rebalance the importance of scale and scalability in our assessment of new ideas? How do we answer to the folks who declare, too slow and not enough? Policy leaders, well, frankly, you, here at the Woodrow Wilson School, need to lead this charge. Innovations need to be supported with less regard to scale, and rather an approach to tackling the comprehensive challenges at hand. And we also need to balance the numeric and the subjective measures. That's my phone. Oh, it's my sister. She wants to listen to what I have to say. Now, this balancing of the numeric and subjective measures may sound like blasphemy to quant jocks here at the Woodrow Wilson School. But I fear that an over-reliance on numbers is really at the heart of the push for scale. In the push for social justice and decreasing human suffering, we should not allow numbers to be the only driver of whether or not we should do things and whether solutions should be tested. Yes, we need to be data-driven. Yes, we need to have accountability playing a role in what we do. But frankly, that alone doesn't tell us a story. At this point, I hope I haven't angered every economist and political scientist in the room. But we should also push for significant support for innovative design and approaches that can tell us whether or not these interventions are working. So we do have a need for data. We just need to put it in the right place. And we need to understand that supporting basic research is one of the responsibilities of all of us, and I would argue even the federal government and philanthropic foundations, not just scaling. In science, we know about that, right? We know about the NIH, the NSF, and others. And government has had, and we hope will continue to have, a significant role around developing the public goods of science research. Research that's not necessarily commercializable and are justifiable from an individual company's perspective, but yet so important to where we're going. In education and social service, there's some support for basic research. There's the Institute for Education Sciences. But even it is starting to put more of its money into looking at scaling. Remember, basic research assumes that there will be failures. And yet we need this experimentation. There's not only failures in research and development, there's failures in business. We know that more than 90% of for-profits fail, but private equity funds are willing to make those investments because they'll reap the benefits with that other 10% that become the Googles of the world. In the government and nonprofit sector, we don't have that mentality. We actually have a fear. We tolerate almost zero risk when funding startups. And that means we're doomed to try safe and we're doomed to be tried and safe. The good news here is that there are points of light. That there are organizations, public leaders, foundations, and thought leaders who get this. SEED is blessed to work with the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, who are wonderful partners with a lot of nonprofits. And they also understand how difficult scaling is and the context and the challenges of too slow and not enough. The Robin Hood Foundation in New York City is working hard to push both scale and innovation at the same time. Thought leaders such as Lee Shore have been making this argument and getting traction over time on the need to balance scaling with other needs. So, in conclusion, let us agree that there's great power to scaling up effective intervention. But let's not make it only the principal criteria by which we decide winners and losers. Let's accept the fact that some solutions are simply not scalable. And let's make sure to keep room for innovation and experimentation. I'm happy and excited about SEED's future, and I think we can scale, but just at our own pace and over time. But I often think about other institutions that can't scale. Does the hyper or over-focus on scaling change our views on them? For example, what about a non-scalable institution that we all know and love? What about Princeton? Since my days as a senior and through the last 20 years of being an alumnus, I've learned and advocated that Princeton should be supported with all of our hearts and minds. And as Toni Morrison so eloquently said at Princeton's 250th anniversary convocation, so while Princeton remains legitimately enthralled with the place of the idea, it must continue to be equally faithful to the idea of the place. The idea of the place is visionary, is change, throbs with life and leans towards the edge. The idea of the place is burrowing into the heart of a theory, of a concept, casting its gaze toward the limitlessness of the universe, not merely moving toward the future, but in certain instances, driving it. The idea of the place despises those forces in academic institutions so fearful of independent thought, so alarmed by challenge that they prefer oblivion, irrelevance, rather than shoulder the hard responsibilities of change. I support Princeton because of the idea of the place, as well as the memories of the place it represents for each of us who have lived here. Similarly, we should be supporting other great experiments for their ideas and their innovation, even if they, like Princeton, are not scalable. Thank you.
So we open the floor.
Questions, thoughts, comments? In the back.
Thanks very much for coming. I'm a senior in the anthropology department here. From what you were saying, I resonate with the idea that people are not numbers at the end, or they're not stats either, nor is the impact.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to know what your definition of scale is then. Is it, you're en route to Miami, I believe that's your second school.
DC, Baltimore, Cincinnati, Miami,
Okay.
are the next two schools.
So I feel like you're customizing per city that you're going to.
Mm-hmm.
But when we talk about innovation from an existing or establishment, for example, DC, scaling within the reach, like you were saying, one of the schools is helping laterally up, back, around, to the whole area benefits. The resource of the students within the school, for example, the seniors, how are they falling in line with your idea of scale? I mean to say, are they starting to scale within the system, if you know what I mean?
So let me address two sets of issues that you've raised, and then feel free to follow up if I've got it right or wrong. The first is, what is my definition of scale? And my definition of scale in the long term for SEED specifically, right? I don't want, we can come back to talking about social innovation in general, is that there needs to be this public boarding school concept in every urban district. But the timing, the pace at which we do this has to be very deliberate. What we're trying to do is very hard, right? It's very hard in a number of ways, and the scaling emphasis has a tendency to push people to focus on growth over quality, growth over intervention, and growth over long-term, sustained foundational work, right? I've seen too many nonprofits who've fallen prey to that. And they fall prey to that because that's where the dollars are and where people are pushing them. I am lucky in that I have a board who is willing to take it slow and steady. But that's not the case in most places. And I know that Eric and I have to fight that pressure all the time. So this overemphasis on numbers and quickness is the problem. As far as scaling kind of on an individual basis and the students themselves, I think that by far the most exciting thing on a micro basis that we do is the fact that our students, significant number of them, come back to Washington, D.C. Right. Every year at the Seed School of D.C., we have one RA slot for an alumnus or alumna. And it's only for 1 year because you want to get them out the nest at some point, but it gives us a chance to interact and to get kids to come back, to work with our students, to give back in a very specific way. But if I had to guess, 75% of our college graduates are now back in Washington, D.C. And they're in the community. They're specific and great examples of what we can do if we do it well. So that's the way in which I think scale really works. Yes?
Raj, I wonder.
Can you please introduce yourself next?
I'm Stan Katz in the Woodrow Wilson School. A comment and a question. The comment is, it's fascinating to me as someone who studies philanthropy, that you're attacking scale. I agree. I'm in print agreeing with you. I think that's right. But of course, scale, in the way you're talking about it, is one of the characteristic attributes of venture philanthropy, which in only this way, really, you've criticized, and the philanthropies who supported you are venture philanthropies, at least all the ones you mentioned are venture philanthropies. And indeed, the critique of venture philanthropy has been that it has been too much emphasis on measurability and scale, and actually in short-term results. And I'd be interested in what you have to say about that. And I'm wondering, whether you can have part of that apple, but that's not my question.
Okay.
My question is, because the most interesting thing you said to me was every city needs a residential public school. I think that's a really interesting idea. And I wonder what the argument is for that. So if I knew that every major city in the country could have one school, what's the social mechanism that makes it worth the investment, a very considerable investment in that school, for kids across the school system?
So, I mean, this also goes to directly to the issue of scale, right? For 5 years, Arne Duncan, when he was CEO of the Chicago Public Schools, tried and tried and tried to get us to come to Chicago. And we decided not to come there just because we want to be very deliberate. We were just starting our second school. We needed to be slow and steady and learn from what we did. And so I asked Arne, you have 430,000 students in the Chicago Public Schools. Why are you working so hard to get seed? Why are you working so hard to get 400 students? And his response was, last year, 22 students died in the Chicago public school system. And I believe that most of them would be alive today if they were in a boarding school. So what we know is that there are such negative consequences for some of the students that it justifies that cost. The other part that we know is you have to separate out the investment challenge, the operating cost, and the what I'll call the capital, small c investment up front. I think that it's actually very easy to make the operating cost argument. Well, actually, I don't not only think so, but I've made it, right? Which is, if we redirect social service funds, what we know is that there's more than $35,000 per student per year that's touching the students we serve. We know that for a fact. We have tracked it in Maryland. So the case that we're making to the federal government, that we've made in Ohio and Florida successfully, and if all goes well, we'll make it over and over again, is just give us those dollars that are touching the kids already, except let's do it efficiently and effectively under one roof so that we're actually getting successful outcomes with the dollars that are already being used by society. Now, just understand, that's not how we did it in DC and Maryland, just for full disclosure, but that's because we were just starting and we were able to convince society to give us more money, right? But now, under the current fiscal situation, we've looked and we've seen what we've learned and said, actually, the dollars already exist. You can also go beyond that, and we know on an ROI basis, I'd be glad to discuss the details around this, the payback is 7 years. You use 3 measures: high school dropouts, incarceration, teenage pregnancy. The societal cost of those 3, within 7 years, the seed school starts to get a positive payback for society. Not for society, for the state's coffers, right? Specifically dollars that the state is spending on A versus B. Okay. So the operating piece, I'm pretty comfortable that we can make the case and we have the analytics behind. The harder example, frankly, is the capital, right? And the capital goes something like this. Raj, I have $40 million. I can use it to start 3 KIPP schools or 1 seed school. Tell me which one I should do, right? And frankly, on a societal level, what you really like to say is we need both. The argument that I'm going to make is that that $40 million for the seed school is, we know, going to give us a return, a societal return over forever. And with the KIPP schools, that's not enough for the capital. That is to say, that helps to start up the schools, that helps to get it up to about 400, 500 students, but I'm not sure whether or not that's enough of an investment into perpetuity. Okay, so now you say, well, Raj, what about 2 KIPP schools versus 1 seed school? Then you can start to do the measures and the calculations, and frankly, what we have come to recognize, which has nothing to do with the calculations, is that KIPP and seed are not having trouble raising private funds. For sure. It is not our constraint to growth. Our constraint to growth is how fast we can get great people to work with us to start more schools. So though on a, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, though on an academic and analytical basis it's a good argument to have, it's actually not necessary right now. Thank you. Anne-Marie.
So Raj, thank you. So you offer 2 models. One would be, the franchise model where you create seed in multiple cities with specs, right? This
That's
is
right.
exactly how we're
Intense
going to do it.
specs.
Intense specs.
Yeah.
Let's say, the McDonald's of education. And the other, well, I mean,
Would you like
that's
fries with
exactly
that?
the point, right? So that the fries are identical wherever they are. Everything is done so that it doesn't matter what people you have, or much less. Or you say, you know, slow and steady, and you're doing it very deliberately, but you know, you're heading for 4 schools. Why isn't there a third model that says you go slow and steady to you and learn and keep building, but you basically say to a whole lot of other entrepreneurs in different cities, hey, we have this concept, we will help you, but you may do this differently in your cities, but you can't scale Princeton, but you do have the Ivy League. But the Ivy League came from, you know, lots of different great universities who are then learning from each other in a league, and all of you then learn from different innovation. Why is that not a third model that combines scale with local innovation?
It very much is, and that's a great point. That third model, I didn't posit because I think that there's still 2 pieces of work that need to be done in order to understand it well. One is that in the case of a very complex intervention like ours, I'm not sure that I'm ready now, and I'm not even sure when I'll be ready to be able to say, here are the books, and we're willing to advise you. Because we are still making so many mistakes. And I don't know when I'm going to be willing to say.
Why not let them make their own mistakes, but you at least teach them from yours?
Maybe after 10 schools, when the field is strong enough to be able to take a failure. So I'll give you an example. Here in New Jersey, there was a Samuel Proctor Academy, which was a boarding school much like ours that was started the year before we opened. That same year, exactly, the Katzenbach School, and the Boston University Residential Charter School. Both of those schools failed in 2 years because they had the wrong financial model. They failed for different reasons, but they all emanated from that. And we actually paid someone to do research of the lessons learned from all of those. And one of the things that we recognized in the first 5 years is we had to crawl out from under that negative brand consequence, and it took a lot of work. And so I'm not willing to let somebody take the risk yet, because it doesn't impact seed, it impacts literally the whole field. At some point, we might be comfortable with it. Sure.
Raj, thank you. I'll second Anne-Marie's thank you. Could you sort of help me think about, now that you've had, 10 years of experience,
15.
How would you rationalize the value of the residential part of the school? Mm-hmm. I know how you thought about it in the beginning. Is that how you think about it now? In other words, if you're going to the DC government, how you're today saying it's worth 2.7 times the cost of educating a student in the DC system.
Are you asking for a philosophical answer or kind of a practical answer? Okay, good. I've got that.
Yeah.
So on a philosophical basis, the idea of boarding was really 2 independent arguments, right? One was the lack of the negatives we could create. A safe, secure, nurturing environment, a place where kids could get 3 meals a day and be comfortable and so on. The second was the gift of time, especially given the fact that we look to work with kids who are significantly behind. Something that, to understand, that may have been implicit but should be explicit. Each of the schools we've started since the Seed School of DC, Maryland, Ohio, and Florida, and for future schools, we have worked with the state to define the population that we serve. That is to say, they are becoming a more risky population each time. In Florida, you have to meet 2 criteria. One is you have to be below the poverty level. The other, you have to meet one of 4 risk factors: homeless, foster care, juvenile justice, or housing subsidized homes. Right. And so when I take those students, the practical and the philosophical of being able to talk about those kids becomes easy. Right. Whereas it's not as easy in DC, and where we have to do a very proactive job of going to find the kids that really could benefit from our school. That's not the case in Maryland or Ohio, and certainly not the case in Florida. And in those cases, we can literally not only justify it, but we can point to the dollars that follow the child. Right? We can literally say, I'll take those dollars, and I'll take these dollars, because those are John's dollars. right? So it becomes easier, and we are very comfortable with that philosophical view. We say, there's a group of kids who need the 24-hour environment. In 1997, we weren't exactly sure what they look like, right? And as we spent more time, we've been able to define it much more specifically. So to answer your question, we've gotten better at taking a population that looks like this and going like this. Yeah?
Thank you very much for the comments. Chris Camposano, the Director of the Program and Teacher Preparation. If I'm understanding correctly, I'm hearing about going to scale about the idea of extraordinary individuals sort of working in the school. You know, to what extent then can you give us sort of a profile, the characteristics of that type of individual, and what do you do as an organization to either recruit and prepare and retain, and do you also have an obligation to be part of that mission? If it's about going to scale and having extraordinary individuals, what's your responsibility sort of in that equation?
So Chris, I'm going to spend the next 5 to 7 minutes on this because this is really important and you kind of get at a couple of different sets of issues. The education reform movement is about to run into its biggest challenge. Over the last 20 years, started with Wendy Kopp's great work at Teach for America and led by many others, including John Schnur at New Leaders for New Schools, we have been able to figure out how to select great leaders from pools, large pools, right? We've kind of figured out the selection effect. We've been able to say, okay, from this pool of folks, if you run them through a process that includes doing X and Y and jumping jacks and jump 20 feet over this building and fly until there, we've figured it out, right? And I'm not suggesting we figured it out completely, but Teach for America has been leading that on the teaching level, New Leaders for New Schools, and KIPP has been leading on the leadership principle level. We're starting to get some idea around that, some idea, which I'll come back to. Here's the problem we're running into. We're running out of those people, right? And at some point, in order for us to truly be societal in how we think about what we want to do and want to improve, we have to get to a model that's the treatment effect. That's able to take poor teachers, decide whether or not you want them, and those that you want, make them good. That's able to take good teachers and make them great. We haven't figured that out yet. And anyone who tells you really hasn't figured it out yet, right? In one of the classes I talked to yesterday, actually it was at lunch, I talked about this phenomenal article written by Malcolm Gladwell in the New Yorker about 5 years ago, when he said that there are 2 types of people who are the most difficult to find and choose. One is NFL quarterbacks, and the other is teachers. Right? That there are no leading indicators, as far as we know, that's allowed us to figure this out yet. Right? Now, I'm lucky. Depending on the position at Seed, the teaching position, I average between 250 and 1,000 resumes for every teaching slot from all over the world. So I have a different problem than school districts and most other schools. I have to separate the wheat from the chaff. Right? And that's hard. It's not the same problem that most people have yet. Right? This is because of the function of the brand equity that Seed has built. We're able to do that. So I don't know the answer to your question. We haven't figured out the answer to your question. But we as a society need to figure it out pretty quickly, because if we don't, we're going to hit a wall. I fear that we're actually already slowing down in terms of the number of innovative, high-performing schools that we can start, because we're still looking at that old model, and we're not recognizing that we need to move to a treatment effect and try to figure that out. Yes?
Thank you. I'm Cecilia Coffey. I'm a sophomore, and I just wanted to add a follow-up question about teacher preparation. Rather than retraining, is there a point in Seed's future that you'd consider maybe partnering with programs such as Princeton's teacher preparation and initially training teachers that fit your extraordinary criteria?
Yes, but that's not fair. And I mean that not from a Seed perspective, but from a societal perspective. I think that what the program does is great. And I'd be willing to train people to learn how to do the great things that we do as well. But I don't think that it needs to be a flow just to us, right? I think that Princeton's responsibility is to try to get teachers as many different places as possible. So to answer your question, yes, we can do it. And I think I can do it because I get Princeton students as my pool, right? Yeah, I think I can do it with Princeton students. But That's not the challenge that I need to face on a societal basis. Does that make sense?
It does. I meant across a number of different areas, especially if you looked at DC, students from DC and had the ability to train them into their own community.
Yes, I think that you could do that, but I think some would meet my pool criteria and some would not, and my fear is that most of them would not. Yeah, Marty, great to see you.
Hey, Raj. Nice to be here. It sounds like what you're saying is what I've been sort of grappling with a lot over the years, the work that we're doing down in Trenton, and that there is an economy of scale for sure. You increase production, your unit costs go down. But there's also another economy, which is an economy of scope, where we're looking at complex systems, right? This is not just an education issue. There are other things going on behind the residential side, the need for that. The stuff that we do is wrapping other kinds of services in that complicate stuff, but it also is honoring the complexity of the system that we're operating with, right? The challenge has been is that while we love that complexity, it's also been this sort of logical framework that the academics would say, you know, this is a unique approach to a unique setting, therefore we can't compare to anything, therefore everything gets dumbed down, and, you know, there's a flabbiness to the third sector, to the nonprofit world. Part of the flabbiness is a function of our absence of measures of success. To know what the value of those other things are that are the scope of the intervention, right? Not just that singular scale. And so I'm wondering if you've had much success in helping others really drill down on the research front to be able to start to define that economy. It's just as real as economy of scale, and that's that economy of scope, but it's going to take, you know, some more data, more research for us to get there.
So when we had Roland Fryer do our study that looked at the effectiveness of our students versus those who were not selected, the outcome measure that he used is standardized test scores, which just drives me nuts because we all know that there's no correlation between standardized test scores and actual success. But no correlation, I mean no correlation, right? Positive, negative, nothing. You can't, there's too much noise, you can't figure it out, the data doesn't make sense. So we worked with MDRC, a big research shop, and said, let's do this right. Let's take the Maryland school, let's take the DC school. Let's use actual measures and outcomes that we really are looking for, right? That we're looking for kids who make it from the 6th grade into the high school at Seed. Kids who make it from the high school to graduating from high school. Kids who make it from graduating high school into college. Kids who don't get incarcerated. Kids who don't, you know, end up pregnant. Boom, boom, boom. Real, actual measures. And in 18 months, I'll be able to tell you what these measures are telling us. But this is a challenge, right? We're lucky in that we have a bit of a gold-plated possibility here because of the fact that we have a lottery that can start to tell us this. So that's one part of the answer. Let me tell you the more frustrating part of the answer. Outcomes, all of these outcomes are just basically leading indicators for the success that you actually want, right? People ask me, what are you looking to do, Raj? And the only measure I'm really interested in is that we create good citizens. Okay, how do you measure that? Well, maybe we follow them every time they go and vote. Maybe we decide which ones they should vote for. No, you know, you should figure out whether or not they have a job, right? They're employed. Whether or not they, you know, finish college. And if they didn't finish college, if they got a good paying job, that's sustainable. And trying to figure those things out and those measures is literally a 15-year process, right? So in 1997, I taught 40 students, including Sofia Echeverria, as a 7th grader. She's now finishing her master's at UC Santa Barbara. I'm sorry, she's the class of 2009 graduate from Princeton. And I'm finally starting to see the outcomes I was looking for. And what I'd really like to be able to do is to look at that outcome and say, what can we learn from it to improve our 7th grade program 15 years later? And my challenge is that I have not yet gotten comfortable with the leading indicator measures. Yeah, they'll give me directional ideas of whether or not we're kind of going the right way, And some of them, especially like, for instance, the number of students who apply and get into four-year colleges, right? That's good. But we also know, as you and I discussed, that our special education population is increasing at the seed schools. And so as it does, some of our students, maybe four-year colleges isn't the place they should go. And they'll be great citizens by doing other things. So the problems, the challenges, and the societal problems, the complex ones we're trying to solve, is that you don't have input A and output B 3 days later. You don't have it 3 years later. You have it 30 years later. Right? I mean, for those of you who may not be aware, there was a study called the Perry study that looked at the implications of programs. I think it was Head Start, right?
It was a preschool program.
Preschool program. The effect of it was phenomenal 30 years later. They followed the kids.
But you could see it already in high school.
You could see some of it in high school, but you weren't able to quantify it until.
They were impressive 40 years later.
Yeah. So that's some of the challenges that we have on a societal basis. And the reason it's such a challenge, you might say, oh, Raj, this is just kind of you being a scientist and analytical. No. The challenge is because I then have to go back to policymakers and say, how do I justify the ROI? How do I justify KIPP versus seed? How do I justify housing development versus seed? Right? All of those things that need to be done when you have finite amounts of investment, as we all do, and try to figure out what are the best interventions. It's not easy. Yeah.
I know that back in the beginning when you were starting to talk to people, that one of my good friends and classmates said to you, it will never work.
Yes.
And we also know that he became one of your stalwart board members.
Continues to be a great board member.
I've known you somewhat over the years, and your way of presentation is such, well, we did this, and this, and now we're here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Were there things that were personally discouraging for you over the early years in particular? And what did you do that you can kind of objectively point to that is part of you that got you from there to here?
Let me answer the last question first. Eric and I, when we look to bring people on to work with us, there's a whole process before they get to the two of us. We're looking for only two characteristics. The first one is that they're owners. They're not looking to be employees, that they're looking to own what Seed does across the board, right? That they're not focused on just their job, that they're focused on making sure that the institution is going to be great and that they believe that their work in any capacity does that. And I can talk in detail about how we do that. It's a second one, though, that really applies to this. We look for optimists. Right? The thing that Eric and I look back on and recognize that differentiated those folks who could really be successful, even when they had the equal set of skills, was that some people are just plain optimists. And those people really get things done. That in the face of everyone saying no, that they still believe that you can do yes. And the way in which we really try to get at that is through a whole set of behavioral interviews that really focus on what have they done before, examples of challenges and how they got through it. And Eric and I spend a lot of time at the end of interviews to talk, is this person an optimist? Right? To the other question of, were there times that were really challenging or aspects that were really challenging? I'm going to generalize it a little bit.
Actually,
Okay?
I said discouraging.
Okay.
But your answer illustrates the point.
He's an optimist.
Exactly. Many people in this room have heard this because I've talked about it in every single class. The greatest challenge to the work that we do on an operational basis is not the kids that we serve. It's managing the adults. People ask me, gosh, working with inner city kids, that's got to be tough. I'm like, the kids are simple. It's the adults that drive me nuts. And anyone here who's ever had to manage adults can know and shake and smile and laugh, but they know it, right? And especially managing people in the nonprofit world, where part of the reason that they come to work is because they believe that they have equity in the vision and the mission and have the right and should have that belief, right? I'm not denying it. But by having that desire, you have to manage them so carefully. And frankly, I suck at managing adults, right? I didn't recognize it then. I recognize it now. I've gotten better. I can do it okay. More importantly, I can hire people who work with me who are great at it, right? Some of you know Piper Davis, who's just phenomenal at this. And that's really important, and that's really one of the big issues. Secondly, I think that we as a society are really lying to ourselves about where our kids are nowadays. And it's easy to do that because you can talk about it in numbers. When I tell you that a child is behind 2 to 3 grade levels, okay, conceptually that means a 6th grader instead it's a 2nd or 3rd grader. But until you actually spend time with that child and realize the impact of that on everything else around that child's development, the social aspects, the other challenges, you don't really recognize just how badly we have just written off generations of children. And we're bearing the fruit of that now. One little story just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that I learned. In our first year at the Seed School, about 2 weeks into the school year, one of our young ladies, remember this is 7th grade, so she was either 11 or 12, started sucking her thumb. So we went to our school psychologist and said, she started sucking her thumb. And he said, you know what, let me talk to her. I think I have an idea of what's going on. Had a couple sessions, and about a week later he came back and he said, okay, let me tell you what's going on. This young lady has had such a traumatic childhood that she has literally skipped a whole set of development in her childhood. And SEED is the first time that she is in a safe, secure place that she can actually go through those developmental pieces. Think about it. Here's a child who's 11 who, for the first time, is feeling safe and secure to suck her thumb. Something that my little daughter Annie did between the ages of 6 months and 2 years. Think about the implications of that trauma on that young lady, besides all of the numbers that I can tell you about where she is and how she's doing academically. The good news is she graduated from Lesley University 2 years ago. So we can, right? The brain is a wonderful thing, right? If you get to it quickly enough, you can do those things. But let's not lie to ourselves. Numbers can allow us to kind of delude ourselves about what's going on. And that was very depressing. Oh.
Yeah. I recently listened to a radio documentary on an issue that KIPP is having with the fact that after this intensive intervention in the lives of the students, they go to college.
Exactly.
Exactly. And they've had students struggle in college. Is this an issue that you all are confronting?
Yes.
And are in a position to kind of help support the students beyond 12th grade?
Let me make sure that everyone understands this issue, because it is one of the most challenging issues that all of the high-performing schools, charter schools, educational management organizations are facing. And we all started to recognize it at about the same time, which was about 3 years ago. We were all doing wonderful work. Yes, Aspire, KIPP, Achievement First, Uncommon Schools, ... right? I mean, some of the people who were really getting the outcomes that we'd hoped. And then our kids went off to college. And they were failing in enormously bad amounts, excuse me. Not relative to first-generation low-income graduation rates, which, just so you know, is 11% of low-income first-generation students who start college graduate within 6 years. Right? These schools were doing better than that, but none of us got into this business to do better than that. All of us got into the business to magnitudinally blow that out of the water, right? I think we're all shooting for 75% or more. None of us are there yet. We started to have conversations. And in fact, YES and SEED got together and got the Gates Foundation to fund a year-long project where we all got together to start to have a conversation, because we were dealing with the same issue. And though a number of things came out of it, here's the single most important thing to know. That all of us were so focused on academic outcomes that we were doing a really poor job around the non-cognitive skill development that our children needed to have. All of the grit, intensity, perseverance, those pieces that when you fail, force you to get up, be an optimist, and get back to work. In our case, the problem we had is we didn't allow them to fail. We literally would catch them, right? And we could. They were with us 24 hours a day. So the first time they failed was at school, at college, when they weren't there and they didn't know how to handle it. And so there's a lot of research that's started to be done on this, led by Angela Duckworth out of Penn, just doing some phenomenal things. And she has partnered with KIPP and Uncommon Schools, a couple other schools, and with SEED, to start to figure out how do you develop these non-cognitive skills. We have some ideas about using the non-academic time to do outward bound type programs, to get the kids out and facing challenges and working as teams, right? Put that tent up in the middle of the snowstorm. You know, I'm just using that as an example, but we're all trying to figure out how to develop those things. Almost all of them are focused on kind of the non-academic pieces. And it's both exciting and challenging and sobering at the same time. Yeah.
A related question, how do you handle the weekend home? Seems to be a space during the school experience where you lose control and where problems could emerge. And I'm curious, I remember Jeffrey Cannon, when he was here, said that if he hears one of his students in trouble, he or one of his teachers will go and be there and get them out of trouble. How do you manage that so you don't kind of lose ground? And then a different kind of question, if you were out of this role and you became Secretary of Education, okay, what's one thing you would be pushing for right now at a broader level?
So just so everyone understands, philosophically, I don't have a problem with our students staying with us 7 days a week and going home 1 weekend a month. In fact, that's how we started the program. The challenge is that the cost basis for that is exponentially higher than what we can do, because you need to bring a third group of faculty in. And so suddenly your cost per student goes from $35,000, $36,000 per year to $47,000 to $50,000. And there's no sustainability around that. Okay? So then the question becomes, how do you handle it? And there's two issues. One issue is what happens when the child is back home for those 48 hours, and how do you deal with that? And then the second challenge is what happens for those children who don't want to go back home? Right? So let's take each one of them separately. For those students who go back home, Rajiv Vinnakota, can do very, 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 very little. But here's what we can do. We have dorm counselors, life skills counselors, who live in those dormitories, who look like our kids, who have grown up where our kids have grown up, who have gone to college and graduated from college, who can help our students navigate the challenges that they have in a way that I can't. Right? And it is about navigating those challenges. You try to do as much as you can, but the reason why our students come back on Sunday night and not Monday morning is because of this issue. You want them back, you want them focused, you want them finishing their homework, getting ready, refocusing on SEED after being away. The bigger challenge is what we do with those kids who don't want to go home. Right? And because I'm being recorded here and I don't want my insurance company to find out what I'm doing, let's just say that we do everything possible in order to make sure that they're not going back into a threatening situation or a situation where they may not want to come back to SEED because there's something going on at home that's really causing trouble. Our kids, so many of them, also suffer from survivor's guilt. Right? The idea that, oh, I'm getting away and look at what's going back at home. We're lucky in that in all of our schools we've been able to get a sibling preference. So once one child gets in, you don't have to go through the lottery. I mean, you have to sign up and go through the process, but there's no lottery. You just have to go through that process and you're in. And so we're able to get that. But that still exists because so many of them worry about their mom or aunt or somebody else, and so many of them are the responsible party. Gosh, I wish I could tell you. Let me just start by saying that Arne Duncan has been the greatest United States Secretary of Education, with really nothing meant against any other U.S. Secretary of Education, but he's just phenomenal. You know, just to be around him and with him and learn from him is amazing. What would I do if I could be in his shoes? I would really like to find a third way on this union issue. I don't know what it looks like. I know that we at SEED are starting to get ahead of it. In Cincinnati, we have figured out a very innovative agreement with the Cincinnati Public Schools and the union, where all of our academic faculty are members of the union, but SEED retains the right to define work rules and hiring and firing, which to us were the two biggest issues that we had to be able to get around. And our hope is that by doing that, by still having a union shop, that we can try to demonstrate that you don't have this monolith, union's bad, right? But rather that if you can create innovation in some ways or form, that you can drive innovation from charters, traditional public schools, and getting the unions to engage on that. How that's done, I don't know, but we have to figure it out. Because I'll say one thing here just so everyone knows it. We will never, ever improve the overall school system if we don't figure out how to work with district schools and how to work with unions, right? You can have as many charter schools as you want. You can have as many voucher programs that you want. They are going to just be not an insignificant, but a small portion of how we are successful. And so for me, that would be where I'd like to spend the time.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. This is not my question, but I think hiring, firing is absolutely the key. I also think it's the Maginot Line when it comes to relationships with unions. So it's a tough one, but I agree it's got to come. You talked about a spectrum of solutions and the pressure to expand and so forth. So my question, I guess, is a policy one about optimality. Your solution might be the best thing in the world for everybody, but it's not going to be available for everybody.
Yep.
And so how do you optimize various solutions, whether it's residential or whether it's charter or whatever? And part of what I'm driving at is the selection mechanism. I mean, lotteries get criticized on both sides.
They do.
They get criticized because you're not necessarily taking the people who can benefit the most from your school, whereas somebody else, city that I know the best, I guess, or one of them I know the best is Newark, where somebody else can go to Robert Treat and do okay. Yeah. So how do you optimize that? Is a lottery the best way to do it? And on the other side, which is, I don't know if we're going to solve this one today, but a lot of people who are just pure public school advocates say lotteries are unfair because if your parents are on drugs or you don't have parents or whatever, you never get in the lottery in the first place. My answer to that is if you see 5 people drowning in a pond, do you let them all drown so you're fair to everybody? But I'd be interested in your comments on that side of the lottery question as well.
So this is easier to answer philosophically than practically, right? Yeah. The philosophical answer, unfortunately, is something that that most people wouldn't be comfortable saying. The philosophical answer is triage, right? That figuring out a system that's district-based that says, okay, you've got a number of students, what's the best response for each of them and how do you place them in each one? You have 2 significant barriers to that right now, right? One is individual charter schools, right? They're individual entities and they've either all got to buy in or you've got to change the way that the system looks. DC is actually trying to do that a little bit with its charter school movement. The other barrier is who gets to choose. Right? Practically speaking, who gets to play God? Right. One of the things that's most exciting to me about our lottery is that I'm not playing God. Because if you took those 100 students in 1998 that were in our lottery and looked at the 40 that got picked, and if you said, Raj, you can pick any 40 out of this 100 that you think are most likely to graduate, I actually don't think I would do any better than we did with the 40 that we got. Right? And so this becomes a real challenge. The other aspect of this is just how these things become politicized. I can just give you one example. When we were finishing the campus for our seed school, our permanent campus in DC, the fire marshal's office came through, right, to do the final check and so on and so forth, and our construction person's there and so on. And right before he signs it, he says, okay, you guys are all ready. I have one last question. I have a nephew who really needs to come to this school. Now, thankfully, our response would be, great, put him in the lottery, right? We're able to bypass those issues. But think about just expanding that one example to the politicization of how you allocate finite resources.
I think it's time to bring it to a close. We could be here all night. Thank you so much, Ron.